Hello and welcome to Positioning Digital Assessment as Key to the Online and Blended Learning Experience, a webinar discussion held in partnership between Times Higher Education and Inspera Assessment. My name is Ashton Wemborn and I'm the Special Projects Deputy Editor at THE. I'll be chairing today's session. We're joined by a panel of experts and decision makers from North America's higher education sector. So I'd like to introduce Ismail Fayed, Director of Educational Technology at Yorkville University, Jeff King, Executive Director of the Center for Excellence in Transformative Teaching and Learning at the University of Central Oklahoma, and Ishan Kolhatkar, UK General Manager of Inspera Assessment. Thank you very much to our panel for joining us today and to our audience for tuning in as well. We'll be taking questions throughout the session, which you can put to us via the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. So please do put any questions that you have to our panel. During the pandemic, teaching shifted entirely online for many institutions, while others adopted a blended model. So it's no surprise that assessment quickly became digital too. Now, as universities shift towards a more sustainable and scalable blended model of education, digital assessment has the potential to become an integral part of the learning experience. However, this introduces new strategic challenges for higher education institutions. I'd like to begin today's discussion by asking how the innovation and improvements enabled by digital assessment can be retained as universities move towards blended learning. So perhaps we can start with Jeff there. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on at Yorkville?
Yes, absolutely. Our pandemic approach, if you will, very definitely, as I'm sure, was similar at many of the institutions where all of you are located. It's similar to what occurred there. We initiated what we called an extended classroom model, which is much like a face-to-face with synchronous Zoom. So with spacing, social distancing and masking, only about a third of our students could be in the classroom, the other 2/3 attending synchronously via Zoom. So in terms of assessment, this meant that our faculty had to make certain adjustments, especially in terms of doing things like assessing projects, especially group projects, figuring out how to deal with the group dynamics and things of that nature. But in conversation with our faculty and with then importantly, the people who support the faculty in the technologies that were being used, what we discovered is that the faculty quickly understood that compared to the pre-pandemic environment, the ones who were functioning mostly in the face-to-face learning environment in classrooms are the ones who had, of course, the most difficulty making the transition. The faculty who had been teaching fully online classes understood the necessity of engaging students for formative assessment within an asynchronous environment. What our face-to-face faculty had to then grapple with was understanding how to do that well in an environment that they weren't used to functioning in. So we did a lot of faculty training, provided faculty support, but here is our key takeaway. It is the fact that faculty realized that there was a far greater need for much more formative assessment than perhaps they had been doing, especially those who were teaching or mostly teaching just in the face-to-face classrooms. And so for getting that formative feedback, that's where we were able to provide some supports in how to use the existing learning management tools in order to do that. And it's not that we don't provide faculty good training and good support for functioning in virtual environments. But it was very interesting to see faculty's realization on their own part that there needed to be more formative assessment. And then they became very intentional about how they could make that happen virtually and what kinds of tools they could use to do that. And so in speaking with colleagues around the country at other teaching and learning centers, for example, we've heard very similar things. The pandemic forced, in some ways, more attention being paid to say it simply, good teaching, no matter which environment you're teaching in. And that might be one silver lining that came from the pandemic experience in higher education.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear that that shift to digital kind of triggered a more wide-reaching rethinking of those sorts of models of learning and also assessment. And I'm interested to speak a little bit more about, once you had that realization that there was a real need for more formative assessment, what exactly was the next step for you at Yorkville to put that in place?
Yes, at our institution, that was excellent information for us in our teaching center, because that meant that we then had a sort of playbook for offering additional workshops, additional opportunities for faculty to engage with the idea of formative assessment in general, but then which we were able to tweak, if you will, to formative assessment when you're dealing in what our university's term was the extended classroom environment. And so from a teaching center perspective, the way that we accommodated to this was to take our existing workshops, resources, book groups, things of that nature, on formative assessment, and then to customize, if you will, a little bit more for doing things in an environment where you're not able to get immediate feedback from students in the same fashion that faculty who had been teaching only in the face-to-face environment were used to. So I can say that it was very helpful to understand. We surveyed faculty, of course, both before we had to make what we call the pandemic pivot. And those of us in higher ed know the pandemic pivot had to occur in a really, really short period of time, like 2 weeks, basically. And so knowing, based on surveys, both before and after, based on discovering that the faculty themselves were discovering this need for increased formative assessment, that was very helpful for us in supporting the faculty. And then in the follow-up surveys, we discovered that faculty were appreciative of that support. But interestingly, and this is only because it comes in anecdotally in the narrative responses to survey questions, there were faculty who indicated, you know, I hated having to do this. Nobody wanted to do the pandemic, but as a result, I feel like I'm doing a better job now, assessing where my students are across the course of the class. And so that was gratifying to be able to have a good takeaway from everything that was going on.
And Ismail, have you had a similar experience of that pandemic pivot that Jeff mentioned, and the way that you're now approaching assessment?
Yeah, definitely. I think we did, although our situation was, or could probably be described as slightly better. So as an online university, many of our programs were originally designed as online programs. That doesn't really cover all the programs we have. So we had to make that similar shift and go through very similar experiences and decisions in a very short time and addressing different needs. However, I think with all that being the case, I think everybody is really lucky to be in a time where we're not thinking about change, we are forced to change. I mean, like being in that, in academia and in that field for so many years, I've seen how sometimes it's so hard to get things changed because of, like, again, the policies, this technical requirements, or so many other external factors that could play a role. But like it's like the whole globe has been forced to adapt, change, and innovation all of a sudden in a very short time. And thinking about it from a different perspective, of course, like we had to suffer from all the anxiety and stress of issues related to the pandemic itself, but at the same time thinking about it from an academic and educational perspective, I think that was a great opportunity for like new practices and innovations, and you can say thinking out of the box that we have maybe adapted for hundreds of years. And with that, like probably we had new opportunities for more resilience in teaching and learning and assessment. We had more opportunities for adapting new technologies and new apps and even new policies and strategies. Considering better opportunities or more opportunities for research and additional scholarly activities was also a major one at that time, where, like, with the help of many colleagues, we were able to produce a handbook for teaching and how teaching will look like and how assessment will look like after or beyond the COVID situation. And again, another opportunity for innovation in terms of introducing new apps to all our programs or most of our programs, new practices, instructions and instructional elements of courses or assessments. Again, reviewing the different aspects of testing and how to introduce online testing with better standards and more standardized procedures, and perhaps training. Another area that we have really invested in was faculty development, and how that has impacted on every individual on campus in terms of like what we also adapted something we called remote synchronous delivery for some courses, where tools like Microsoft apps were used to manage discussion questions rather than the learning management system. And then that was supported by additional features in the LMS or tools that the instructors or professors may introduce themselves.
Thank you. I wonder, now that we're beginning to move away from that kind of 2-week rush that Jeff spoke about earlier to just make sure that people's assessment was happening, how now will your institutions make sure that that digital assessment is adding value to the student experience, as opposed to just ensuring that what needs to get done gets done? Jeff, perhaps you can speak to us about, is there anything that you will not bring forward with you into that blended learning space? And is there anything that you'd like to see put in place moving forward?
Well, one observation that we made during this process as faculty were trying to become more facile with assessment in these environments is that the faculty discovered, if you will, some of the existing tools within the LMS that they had not been using. And specific to one of the questions that's come in terms of, what specific tools were utilized as we were helping faculty get more comfortable with more frequent formative assessment in these environments. One of the so-called discovered tools is the fact that in our learning management system, it's quite easy for the faculty member to provide video feedback, audio feedback, different kinds of feedback, in addition to, let's say, only responses to an assignment or markup on a paper, things of that nature. And this had a positive trickle-down effect regarding equity and access. And it's not that our faculty are unaware of the need to be equitable in how assessments are done, but the fact that the pandemic environment provided them the opportunity to look at some different kinds of ways to assess their students and then try them out, work with them, I think helped give at least some faculty a sense of comfort with the idea that equitable assessment does not have to mean a different bar for different students. And we, over the past 2 to 3 years in particular, have had numerous programs, workshops, ongoing learning communities, and so forth around the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the fact that you're able to assess a student, let's say in a one-to-one video, and have that student communicate more successfully to help you understand what she knows compared to what she may be able to express in a written format. I think that this was an eye-opening opportunity for some faculty regarding this kind of assessment, or this idea of finding different ways to assess students so that it can be equitable, and you're able to, in essence, filter out some of the tripwires that have nothing to do with what the student actually knows, and yet which in another kind of an assessment environment may unjustly or unduly penalize that student. And so to the question about what tools, I think it's more that the faculty discovered how to use existing tools for assessment that they hadn't used before. And then in some cases, at least based on feedback, we're happy to discover that this really worked. We actually have, and I cannot recall the percentages off the top of my head, but one of the post surveys that we did, we asked faculty, okay, now that you've lived through this for a year, if you had your rathers, how many of you for classrooms going forward would want to continue doing the extended classroom? How many want to go back and just do face-to-face, etc.? And we were surprised to find out that we had somewhere on the order of about a third of our faculty who said they groused about the learning curve. Obviously, 100% of faculty complained about the learning curve. But after they got into the saddle and comfortable with it, about a third of our faculty said, yes, I want to continue, at least for some of the classes during my course in the future, to use the extended classroom model. So we felt very good that this kind of assessment in this kind of an environment worked for those faculty.
Thank you. I think that the conversation about access is a really important one, and one that I'd like to return to a little bit later in our conversation. But I think also your point about faculty discovering these tools that were already available to them, getting comfortable with them, and then feeling more open to explore other tools at their disposal is another really interesting point. And Ishan, I'd like to come to you and sort of speak a little bit about whether you have seen a change in the way that faculty are approaching digital assessment, and whether you think that there's more of an appetite for perhaps more complex tools or innovative tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, my video is frozen for me. I'm not sure if it has for you, but
yeah, it has.
Right. Well, hopefully you can all still hear me. Well, firstly, good afternoon, everyone. Very, very, very nice to be here. Jeff, I'm going to steal your phrase, pandemic pivot. I've not heard it before, but it certainly does describe what I went through and what I know others went through. It's also a real pleasure to speak to people in North America at a reasonable hour. I'm a big NFL and baseball fan, and so most of my interactions with North America come late at night for me. And frankly, pandemic pivot sounds more like a Derrick Henry move than it does something in academia, but point taken. I was at a university before I was at Inspera, and I was there during the start of the pandemic, and the pandemic pivot for assessment came down to me and a small team of others. And I think actually what we had before that was the learning and teaching pivot, which was how do we get everyone online in courses that weren't online. And then there was probably about a 3-week period before people thought, hang on, assessments, we've got to do those as well, don't we? And I was at a university which turns out lots of lawyers and accountants taking professional exams. So there was absolutely no opportunity to say we can defer these because it would defer someone's qualification as a professional. And in almost 50 to 70% of the cases, their job, because they had a job to go to on qualification. So where I was, yes, we did look at the VLE, but the university I was at was already using Inspera. It was my project to implement Inspera. And what it really did was speed up the adoption rate so that we could get it working for both the exams that the university administered by themselves, but also crucially for those assessments that were governed by as we call them here in the UK, professional statutory regulatory bodies. So things like the bar, the state bar, for example. So while VLEs are capable of doing some assessment, there is the benefit that I saw in my previous role of using an assessment platform. And of course, I would say that now because that's where I work. But the key bit for me is that this is about a blend. This is about making sure you're using the right tools for the right things. Because if you have a professor who wants to set up a quick class quiz for people to do tonight, before they come to class tomorrow, then your VLE may well be, your LMS may well be exactly the right place to do this, because you can do it quickly. It's a couple of questions, you can get it online. When it comes to high stakes assessment, however, there is, in my view, a need to make sure that you've got the right tool for the right purpose. So one of the things to consider with an LMS is that as a learner, you're interacting with it sporadically. You might click on it to look at a PDF and then click on to look at a video. And so your interaction with it is from time to time. Doing an assessment, you're going to be clicking on it quite a bit. If it's MCQ questions or typing in your essay answer. I'm glad my video has frozen because I've acted both of those out and you haven't seen them. But there's a very different strain there on your LMS. I think the other aspect is that students need perhaps different tools. One of the things that we're developing over the course of 2022 is the ability to use the Microsoft Office suite, for example, in a secure lockdown environment, because that replicates the kind of authentic assessment that we're all striving to do. And really, at sort of the heart of this is that authenticity. I think what the pandemic pivot, I really am stealing the phrase, has now provided us is an opportunity to look beyond the barriers that we might have seen in the past, where we thought, this is too hard, we'll do it another day. We've done paper and pen, we've done the LMS, we know how to do this. The pandemic forced us to do things differently. Now, we definitely shouldn't keep all of it, because some of the things were a pivot and some of the things we don't need to keep because they aren't ideal. But what they've also done is given those early adopters who really wanted to do something new a chance to show what it does. And as I've seen, both in institutions I've worked at and ones that I work with in this role, it's a chance for others to say, you know what, I was a skeptic, but I've seen this and either I'm still a skeptic or in many cases, it does work. And that collaboration of learning and teaching specialists, learning technologists, faculty in all of their guises with their cognate specialties, and then the wider university team together provides that innovation that allows people to actually move their assessment on 1 or 2 steps and improve ultimately that student experience.
Thank you, Ishan. I think that point about authentic assessment is is something that's growing in conversations about assessment moving forward, and it's something that maybe better equips students to enter the workplace and do the job that they are there to do. Ismail, I wonder if that authenticity is something that you're considering in the way that assessment's delivered now, and how can we continue to make sure that job-ready skills and all of those concerns are really central to assessment?
Yeah, I think authenticity in assessment is crucial, although it really starts long time before the pandemic, but it proved to be quite relevant and important, that played a huge role in the past few months or years. So like we probably indicated in the beginning, there are mainly two types of assessment that we normally look into: the formative, or what we may call the authentic activities, and we also have the authentic assessments. So the main difference, we're looking into either the formative assessment, and at the same time we also try to consider what students have learned and achieved within a program or a course. So in both cases, we have to be quite creative and come up with so many different ideas and options for the instructor or for students. And when this situation started, we were already implementing or thinking about some development of different infrastructure, including our LMS. And probably in a very similar case to Jeff's, we had like certain tools that were not very popular within our LMS that we started to promote more and develop more or upgrade. So one of them was, as an example, is H5P, which is a free add-on or a plugin that is quite popular for many, or it's also supported by many LMS, including open sources like Moodle. And it really opens huge opportunities for interaction, engagement, like using case-based scenarios and several other tools. Something similar, we also use the case scenarios or case analysis activities. This is normally very popular in business programs or other similar programs. And also we had some of our colleagues were interested in sharing video feedback. So feedback plays a crucial role in online teaching and remote teaching. And so thinking about feedback, and the traditional type of feedback that many institutions offer is done through discussion questions or discussion forums. So we try to move this into a better level or a higher level through video feedback or audio feedback. And we found two interesting options to use in that case. One of them was Screencast-O-Matic, which is a video tool. It has both free and paid options. And with that, or maybe something similar to also Microsoft Flipgrid. So both of these apps offer video feedback. And this kind of feedback is also accessible in terms of you can add captions, you can add, labels or animations. So students will have the full experience of receiving the comments and ideas from the instructor, or even sharing messages together as a group and communicating those messages in a rich media format. Another one was also the turned-in. So the majority of us may recognize turned-in as a similarity tool for detecting cheating and academic misconduct, but that's really one level of turned-in, and that was again another huge opportunity for us to explore and develop and share lots of interesting stuff with our faculty. So within that package, the turn-in package, which again can be offered through the LMS, we are able to introduce feedback features, including text feedback, audio recorded feedback, And similarly, they also offer the peer review feature. So with the peer review, you're able to assign students different assignments or text work that they can share feedback anonymously or with their own identities. And that really, adds a better or a higher level of credibility for the work that students are sharing and the quality of that work overall. Probably similarly, we are also exploring opportunities with badges. And I mentioned micro-credential and badges because this is really an interesting feature that first it touches on gamification and creating a sense of competition among learners. But it opens doors for work-related, work-based experiences where students apply what they learn in the industry or the workspace, and then be able to achieve realistic, competencies and skills while still studying, and those competencies can be represented or summarized in a form of a simple accredited badge that they can add even to their social networks or other professional portfolios.
Thank you. And Jeff, I'd like to come to you on that same topic of authentic assessment. I wonder if, again, you're having a similar experience to Ismail, and in terms of those micro-credentials as well that he mentioned.
Yeah, I have maybe a nuanced paradigm around the authentic assessment, the way that we approach it here. In our teaching center and our work with faculty, we have what I guess you could call a hierarchy in terms of what we suggest to faculty is the kind of assessment that you want to shoot for. And the top level on that is authentic assessment, which in the way we use the term means you have to be able to see, to hear that the students can do and know the material. And so that could be in the form of an internship, for example. It could be in the form of a service learning project in the community where you're actually with the students, seeing them do the work with a nonprofit partner. The second level we name direct assessment, and the bottom level we call indirect. And these three levels can happen in both formative as well as summative assessment. But the thing that the pandemic and what it forced upon our faculty in terms of thinking through assessment brought about was because they started to understand the severe limitations to indirect assessment. And what we mean by that is those are assessments which are basically proxies. So if you give a multiple choice exam, you hope that you've written good questions and the students will answer based upon what they do or they don't know. But in truth, that multiple choice exam question is always going to be a proxy because a student could guess the answer right. And there you go. I mean, there are any kind of intervening variables which would make indirect assessment proxy assessments. Direct assessments, while not as good as authentic, they at least are ways in which within the classroom, you're able to build and structure and design assessments so that you get a much more near authentic picture of what students know and can do. So an example of this is a case study in which the students have to dissect an operation, let's say, within a business and recommend a business improvement plan as a case study. That starts to move you toward direct kinds of assessment. So in this pandemic pivot, the faculty then had to think, okay, I'm all about the business of trying to get as much direct assessment as I can compared to indirect assessment. Therefore, within the virtual environment, what are my options for kinds of assessment that are more direct? And what our faculty discovered was that they needed to learn how to leverage the virtual collaboration spaces that would allow their students to do this kind of direct assessment, or provide this kind of insight into direct assessment kinds of activities. And that's what they did. Our faculty became much more facile in using groups, for example, in Zoom or in Microsoft Teams or in WebEx. And incidentally, one of the lessons we learned right up front in the pandemic pivot was not to make any restrictions on which platform faculty desired to use. And so, as cringeworthy as that is to hear, if you're an IT person where you're thinking, oh my gosh, now we have to support 3 platforms for the pandemic pivot, compared to administration mandating, nope, it's all going to be Zoom, or it's all going to be this. We even have a 4th because our art and design faculty really love Slack. So it was hard enough for the faculty to make the pandemic pivot. If we had mandated a particular new platform when they had a preference for another, we realized that was going to be a train wreck. And so we allowed the faculty to do this. And as a result, when we did our post survey, we had faculty who said, okay, I tried Teams, I tried Zoom. Here's the reason why I liked Teams. And we learned that it turned out to be discipline specific in many ways. We have a very strong preference for Microsoft Teams, for example, among our chemistry faculty. And yet in other faculty, among other faculty, it's a very strong preference for Zoom. And so part of that had to do with how easy is it to build the kinds of assessments that we want to do in these platforms, since these are the ones that we have to work with.
I'm really interested to hear what you said about allowing staff to have the freedom to explore the platforms that they want to and use what works for them. But I wonder, for a student, if you go to one class and they're on Zoom and the next class and they're on Teams, and there are all these sort of competing platforms, it's almost like trying to run from one side to campus to the next when you've got a lecture 2 minutes later. So how have you tackled that issue? Perhaps there's a teething problems that now that you've got kind of survey information you've dealt with, but do you find that students are feeling slightly, I don't know, overwhelmed or bombarded by their tutors' choices in that way?
Yes, it's a really good question. And of course, we did the pre and post surveys among students as well. And so we were very alert to student feedback on this particular aspect. But, one of the things that many students said was, well, I'm kind of a student this way in Professor Jones' class, and then I'm kind of this student in Professor Smith's class. So the fact that, I'm a different me in different classes goes somewhat along with the fact that I'm a me this way in Zoom with Professor Jones, and I'm a me this way in Microsoft Teams with Professor Smith. We thought we would get more negative feedback from students on the platform switching than we did. Now, that's not to say we didn't have students that griped about it, because we did. But in terms of the big picture, it was a far lower percentage than what we thought we would see. And when we sat down and we were going through all of this feedback, one of the questions that we had to ask ourselves was, okay on that particular point about the multiple platforms, because of course, one big reason that we did the survey was to figure out what do we do with this technology going forward. The president, to be blunt about it, said, so did we invest $5 million in classroom technology to use for 18 months and then it's going to go away? That's not a satisfying or palatable answer. By the same token, mandating the use of technology simply because it's there is a terrible thing to do. And so the fact that we got this feedback that the students were very receptive to working in these environments, even if it were multiple platforms, and that the faculty choice to go with their preferred environment, we thought far outweighed a situation in which there was only one that was mandated for faculty to use. But to answer your question briefly, it was that we did not get the student pushback on the issue of multiple platforms to the degree that we thought we would.
Thank you. We've had a question from the audience here that brings us nicely back to that important question of access, which I'd like to put to you. The question is there any data besides faculty surveys that demonstrates an increase in equity when performing formative assessments post-pandemic? Ismail, how would you respond to that question?
I think it will be a bit early to answer this question at this point. Like most universities are still either struggling or attempting to bring a new norm to the new types of assessment and what is acceptable or slightly acceptable at some points. So I can't really claim any full awareness of any data on that point at this point.
So let's open the question out, I think, just in terms of assessment and access in general. I think it sounded like, Jeff, you were a big advocate of that. And Ismail, have you had the same positive experience of increasing access, participation, equity via a digital mode of assessment? Ismail, sorry, that was to you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think accessibility and access is still a major issue, and that was actually reflected in some of the research work that we had in our handbook for teaching in the post-COVID situation. And the reason for that, it goes really beyond like the very general reasons to things related to use of devices, in some cases use of or access even to the internet in some regions, or like even parts within a country like Canada, we have locations where accessibility and internet access is still a major issue. At the same time, again, depending on the infrastructure of the organization or the institution and the nature of the activities or the nature of the assessments that are provided, all of these represent major concerns, and that's why it's quite a tricky topic, I would say. And like I remember one of, or at least two of the chapters we received were addressing this particular issue and how it affects people in indigenous locations of Canada, or people who don't have enough devices for their kids or for their like for their own use, or in some cases that could even touch on the software or the application that you have to use within a certain program. So if you study, for example, creative arts or graphic design, and you're supposed to use certain applications or certain software to perform your day-to-day activities, that could be another major concern or an issue. So also for people with disabilities, and you can of course imagine how diverse that would be, and addressing and trying to find enough solutions is always a major question that we have to keep asking and keep searching for the right answers to.
Thank you. Ishan, I wonder if from Inspera's point of view, you've noticed if there's a particular cohort or discipline that benefits from digital assessment more than perhaps others.
I think that perhaps a couple of years ago, we saw that it was predominantly law, medicine, business who were pivoting first to digital assessment. But I'm not sure that that's because the subject matter necessarily befit digital assessment any better than anything else. I think it was a case that you often, and I just so that we're really clear for people from other departments, this is a sweeping generalization, but certainly in Europe, you often see law, medicine, and business departments being the first to try new tools, either by design or by universities putting them up first, often because there's just the thought that this is the least complex set of assessments to deliver, because it's often fairly flat, as I would call it, things like writing an essay or doing some multiple choice questions, and it doesn't involve the perhaps more complicated things that one sees in art or the STEM subjects. So I think that's traditionally what we've seen. Over the course of the pandemic in particular, I think we've seen a change where more people want to see what you can do. And also there's just been that broader thinking. And I think if I, again, big generalization coming, but if I had to categorize universities or higher education institutions across the world into two very distinct categories, it's those who realize that this is an opportune moment to innovate. And there's those who are waiting to see what others will do. Now, each to their own, but I think that those taking that opportunity to see how they can innovate are necessarily going to get the benefits a lot quicker and are going to start to separate themselves from other institutions. I think that in the same way that we saw the sort of VLE revolution, and that's quite marked for me because I finished my undergraduate and then professional law exams. I was a barrister in England for many years. I finished those just before VLEs became commonplace. But that VLE revolution or LMS revolution that came forth very much saw people say, well, of course we can adapt to this. This is a much more sensible way of our learning and teaching materials being available to students and actually having an enriching experience for them. I think we're seeing this sort of second revolution when it comes to assessment. And it's slightly odd in the way that that's happening because assessment is so important to the students in particular. Where we categorize it as educators may be slightly different, whether it's of or as, but there is that real importance to students because I know that I can honestly tell you that when I was 21 and graduating from university, I thought of assessments as something I needed to get through to get that piece of paper that I was after. It's only years later that when I taught that I could see a very different perspective. And so when we think, okay, well, there's some tools out there we can use, or there's a piece of open source software that we could use, I think it's also remembering those students probably see it in a slightly different way. I want my assessment to be run in the best way that it can be. And the answer to that, of course, is going to differ by university and by context and by subject. But I think, as I say, those two broad categories, the ones who are thinking, let's use this space to innovate and try and have that dialogue with our students. Again, the successful universities when it comes to digital assessment, particularly with platforms, are those who involve their students in the way that they do with everything else, with teaching and learning, with the way the universities run. Yes, assessments contain a little bit which has to be secret and out of the way, but the generality does not. I think that if you impose any platform on a student, be it digital assessment, an LMS, Slack, Teams, whatever, I'm Team Slack, by the way, the important thing is that they have all the information that they need. I'm very much a proponent of if you write something like a user guide, it's for everyone. There's no secret staff version. There's no secret version for a dean. This is all of our information. Some of it, the mark scheme, exactly how we operate stuff, of course, that's an operational point. But what are we doing? What does it actually do? How does it work? Particularly with the expansion in the amount of data that we now want to get from all of these activities. What do we get? What's it used for? What do you get to see? It's part of that big open conversation with students that we all must have for any of this to be successful.
Thank you. Jeff, earlier in our conversation today, you said something about different forms of assessment for people with different access needs or different abilities. Doesn't have to be about changing the bar. And I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about how you implement a form of assessment that works for everyone without changing the goalposts.
Exactly. And before I forget it, to the question about formative assessment, research showing that that is something that does have positive outcomes, there is very definitely that body of research. And very quickly, one of the reasons that it does have this positive outcome is because it really helps the learner with self-regulated learning. And so learners can go through a class the first 6 weeks and think they're nailing everything. They take their first exam and realize, oh my gosh, I'm not nailing anything. Well, had the instructor laid out formative assessment points regularly, that would not have happened. So for both learner self-regulation and for the development of deep learning skills among learners, formative assessment has been shown to be very effective. Now, to the question about different learners and the equity and access in assessment, one of the things in our push to be a more equitable and a more diverse and inclusive university, we have had many of these kinds of conversations as they relate specifically to our pedagogies and our andragogies inside the classroom. And so one of the things that has been a challenge for a segment of faculty to understand is the difference between what a successful learner is and what a potential successful learner is. And there is a camp among faculty who are happy to fail 50% of the students because they place 100% of the responsibility for learning on the student. We're trying to help that camp understand, no, wait a minute, the fact that the learner with the potential to achieve at a high level may not be a learner that comes in with a particular skill level, let's say with written English or with a particular skill set. And here the discussion gets dicey because you still have to have the expectation for students to write well and to meet all of the bars that they have to meet by graduation. But there is a way to design your classes as a faculty member and then writ large across the curriculum at the department level and then at the college level. There is a way to design those classes so that these kinds of learners have an opportunity to show what they learn, and just as importantly, an opportunity to fail in a safe place as a part of the learning. And that's where formative feedback is so very valuable, because very typically in a formative feedback scenario, it may be what we call a low stakes assessment, and yet it is a frequent low stakes assessment that allows these kinds of learners the opportunity to improve the skills along the way. And then there are always the cases in which a second language learner, for example, is not going to be as facile with written English as native speaking English learners. And in those kinds of cases, the opportunity for a one-on-one interview is what faculty understand can be extremely helpful in service to equity. The final point I would make is on the access issue. And Ishmael had spoken earlier about this, and we discovered the same situation among some of our students. We tried to bridge that gap by buying a bunch of hotspots, portable hotspots that students could take home, buying a bunch of laptops that students could check out. We increased broadband coverage on our campus because we were discovering that sometimes students had to sit in their cars with their cell phones in order to be closest to an access point so they could attend class. It's a terrible way to go to college. So the infrastructure investment was considerable, but we think it's been worth it. And in service to equity, it was important.
Thank you very much. We've got about 4 minutes left of our discussion today. And in that time, I'd like to just quite quickly address some of the concerns that have been raised, I think often by students around proctoring. And I think that there is often some discomfort with online proctoring, issues like privacy and actually we return to access there continue to come up. And Ismail, in our last few minutes here, I wonder if you've come up against these concerns and what you are doing to address them.
I've really done lots of extensive research on proctoring in the past few months, and I really get to understand what people think and the concerns that students normally share about privacy. Although I personally find it's a tricky really situation for all of us, like thinking about an examination, especially from or thinking about an assessment that is going to be in the form of a test or a quiz for students. It has to be secured, and like normally in any environment where we're doing any type of testing, we have to start first by thinking about the security of the test. And part of that security, of course, is to have, like a safe environment for conducting the test, having like securing the version of the test or the different versions of the test, and like applying certain policies to all the individuals who will be present. And when it comes to online or digital proctoring, there are lots of controversy around that, and it's really hard to impose these restrictions on individuals, but at the same time we can give them a choice. So I think the first point we have to address is to give students a choice. If it's their choice to sit for an online test, then proctoring can or has to be applied, but again they have to consent to that and agree on following the procedures or policies that will be introduced in that case. If that's not an option for them because of any concerns, then in that case, the institution has to provide alternatives. And these alternatives could be that students have to sit on campus at some point or in a computer lab to complete the assessment. But at the same time, we also have to think about other related, factors and consequences. So one of the factors related to the assessments is the design of the assessment itself, or the design of the test. And I came to realize that in many cases, providing one version of a test, especially in a digital or online format, is not really enough. And for that, we started adding or introducing new procedures and even solutions to help both the instructor build more tests and for students guarantee that they have an authentic test in that case. So by that we were able to introduce an add-on for something that you can install in a Microsoft Word application, and with that add-on you're able to build and design enough test items in a very simple format that can be read by the LMS without having to do any coding or any third or use any third-party applications. So that was quite useful in that process. And at the same time, building the assessment in the VLE or the LMS also needs to go through certain standards and procedures. For example, you can like feed the system with enough question items, and then you need to identify the difficulty level of the question items, add settings for randomization, shuffling of questions, and those types of practices would be quite useful. And one additional thing we tried, especially in the quantitative courses like statistics or similar types of courses, was using calculated. So in that LMS, we call it calculated questions, or in other terms, maybe like wildcards. So you can introduce a situation or a question to all students, but the values, the digital values or the numerical values they see are completely different for each individual. So by setting ranges and applying those ranges to the questions, students will have to be involved in completely separate individual calculation processes, which means they can't cheat, they can't copy from one another. And that really adds another layer of security to those types of assessment. In other cases, especially in the beginning of the COVID, we also used Microsoft Teams to proctor some of the assessments so we use an application called OneNotes in Teams, and in that case you see students with their videos. You also see their typing, and that was another attempt to secure these types of questions. And so with proctoring, I will conclude with a note about selecting the right proctoring solution, because many people assume that a proctoring solution is something that I can rely on 100% and say, oh, now I have a secured examination, which is not really true in many cases. And like one of the findings we came across was the fact that some of these proctoring solutions are built on a browser-based, or we can call them like browser-based or Chrome-based. But at the same time, there are a deeper level of security if you build that type of proctoring on the operating system level. So in that way, you can't replicate the operating system and try to fool the system while doing the assessment, or use mirroring technologies or anything similar to that.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our session today. So I'd just like to thank our panelists again for joining us and sharing your insights, and also for to our audience for coming along as well. An on-demand video and summary of the session will be available in the coming days, so please do keep an eye out for that. But until then, I will just say thank you again and goodbye.